I've been told to speak from here, so I will, because I always do what I'm told, particularly when I've told the people who are telling me what to tell me. But I'm sorry at the back, because I'm a slightly dinky Archbishop. Last summer in June, or whenever it was, I was in France for the 100th anniversary of the opening of the Battle of the Somme at Deepval, and we'd stayed in a hotel the night before, and we were coming out of the hotel in the morning. I was going to be on my hind legs later doing something or other, and one of my colleagues heard someone in the hotel saying, "Isn't that the Archbishop of Canterbury?" And his colleague said back to him, "No, too short." Well, there we are. During the US congressional inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic, which was an inquiry of such hopeless ineptitude that it is quite impossible to describe it, particularly from the chairman at the time. At one point, he asked the senior surviving officer of the Titanic, "But didn't you have watertight doors on the ship?" To which the officer replied, "Yes, Senator, we did." He said, "Well, why couldn't all the passengers go through the doors, shut them behind them, and wait until they were rescued?" Presumably when the ship was at the bottom of the Atlantic. And it was obviously an insane question, which I think everyone even at the time realized was insane, that that's not what a watertight compartment does. But even if it had been possible, of course, the only impact would have been you'd have been in a steel box at the bottom of the ocean with no means of getting out. And I was reminded of that by something that the Pope said in Evangelii Gaudium in that passage that was read just now from that letter. It's on page 10 of your service sheet. "More than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within structures, which give us a false sense of security." If the ship is sinking, shutting yourself into a watertight door or watertight compartment is not going to help. I'll come back to why the ship isn't sinking, but also to the temptation we have to look inwards. Your Darson vision is the exact opposite of that idea of going into the security or the false security of structures. Mission and evangelism at the heart of all we do. I can't tell you how exciting it is to see a Darson vision like this. But vision doesn't make action. The characteristics of institutions that are struggling is not that they don't know what is wrong. They may be remarkably good at analyzing their problems. It's not that they don't necessarily have vision. They may have significant levels of vision, but they're incapable of implementing those visions. They're incapable of taking the actions that make a difference. So the question when you've got a vision like mission and evangelism at the heart of all we do, such a thrilling, outward-looking vision that calls the church, again in Pope Francis' words, to be bruised, hurting, and dirty because it's out in the streets, which is what that vision calls us to, is what's going to happen. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince, said this, at least translated: "If you want to build a ship, Don't drum up the men and women to gather wood, divide the work and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. Because they will then become, these are my words, when we yearn for the vast and endless sea, when we look out from the church, and when mission and evangelism is at the heart of all we do, then every person in the church becomes a witness to Jesus Christ. They seek to be out with those who are bruised and hurting as faithful Christian witnesses. And at that point, the issues of implementation begin to solve themselves. Structures, groups, committees, management, training courses are all good things, but in the end, they don't do it. It is our personal involvement in the action implied in the vision. And where that starts, for us to yearn for the vast and endless sea, is we need to be captured afresh by the love of Christ. The point is that mission and evangelism are not survival strategies. They're nothing to do with the survival of the church. They're nothing to do with protecting ourselves. And the radio interview that I can't remember, I think it was yesterday, no, it was this morning, that I had where they were saying, you know, your average age is too old in the church. Your numbers are going down. What are you going to do to survive? And the answer as Christians is actually we're going to stop worrying about it, because that's God's problem. And there's no earthly good in trying to do his job for him. What we need to do is to be captured afresh by the love of Christ. And it's such a huge privilege to have all of you here today. I'm so very grateful that you've even bothered to come. You probably didn't have any choice, but I'm going to be polite. It's polite for me to say so, and I do mean it. It's an extraordinary thing. But the message, if there's no other message that you go away with today, it's this. Put yourself in a place where you're captured afresh by the love of Christ, where you're gripped afresh by the fact that each of us, in all our sinfulness and fault and hopelessness and uselessness to God, are somehow picked up by him, transformed and loved beyond our wildest imagination, beyond anything we can comprehend, not just now, but throughout eternity, and that we will spend eternity delving ever deeper into the depths of that love and never finding its end. It was being captured by the love of Christ that was behind the growth of the church in its early centuries at roughly 1/3 compound per year for the first couple of 100 years. It was being captured by the love of Christ that led the missionary movements of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, which is why there's an Anglican communion today. And some of you may feel sometimes, someone said to me the other day, don't you find the Anglican communion very inconvenient, as though it was a slightly too small pair of shoes? It is the great historic outworking of people being captured by the love of Christ and giving their lives, going to Sierra Leone with their coffins, because the chances of surviving more than 6 months were negligible. It is that capture by the love of Christ that made the difference. And the result of being captured afresh by the love of Christ is that we begin to live and tell the story of Jesus, because it has become so much our story. I said this yesterday, but I'm going to say it again. So apologies to those who were there. One of the things when I found myself, not least thanks to Michael Perham, for which he has my infinite thanks, in this particular role. He was on the Crown Nominations Commission and asked me a particular awkward question, which I should have flunked much worse than I did, I suspect. One of the things, when I found myself in this role, was not out of courage, but out of sheer terror. I made myself promise on my knees before God that whenever I spoke in public in a secular setting, I did give myself the let out of the chamber of the House of Lords, which is probably cowardice, but I wasn't nervous, that any interview, anything, I would mention at some point Jesus Christ. And by the grace of God, I think I've missed it on about 3 occasions, just through sheer cowardice. And I didn't do that, as I say, because I'm a natural evangelist or witness. I did it because I needed to be reminding myself constantly that the only reason that I do this job is because I belong to Jesus Christ. The only reason any of us are here is because we're caught up by Jesus Christ. And one of the extraordinary things is the more you talk about him, the more you realize the truth of that in your own life. Witness is a positive feedback. Mission and evangelism is a positive feedback. It energizes the church. Starting it is the difficult bit. So my opening question for you is this: how real is the love of Christ for you? We all go through patches where that becomes less real. In what ways do you know his immense love? Not talking about feelings here. I'm talking about a steady walk with Christ, perhaps in joy and celebration, perhaps in protest and fury at what is happening in your life, perhaps in lamentation and grief, but walking with him in all those things, all of which we find in the Psalms. The reality of being caught up in the love of Christ is not happy, joyful, bubbly, always with what in my early years after I came to faith in Christ, I was warned off having a sweet, wet evangelical grin, a swag. It's not about that. It's about that intimacy with Christ, which comes from knowing we're loved and therefore have the freedom to shout and scream in fury at what is happening to us, or to celebrate in joy what we have, to be genuine and full of integrity and transparency before God. Because once that is beginning to possess us, just beginning, just that faintest smidgen of a start, we find we are compelled to share it with others. Because we know that it matters that people do not know the love of Christ, that they face both joy and sorrow in a world that seems but a howling wilderness, in which they are mostly, apart from those close to them, alone. And why does it matter? It's because we are convinced, as Paul says, that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them. It matters because Christ died for you and me and rose for you and me. And the consequence is that the church exists to proclaim with confidence with assurance, often with bafflement and puzzlement as to why, but to proclaim that there is no better decision than anyone can ever make in their lives, in any place, under any circumstances, than to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. But people can only decide that if they know. Let me read some words to you that hardly need commentary. They're from Romans chapter 10. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all, and is generous to all who call upon him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they're sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Let's work backwards. The message we have is beautiful. There is nothing more wonderful than the good news of God who broke into the world to declare and reveal and proclaim and establish love and the future of the kingdom of God. There is nothing more wonderful than the love of Jesus Christ. It's obvious, we know that. But how many others do? Why are we increasingly finding through social media, through other ways, that the hatred and bile that is around spilling out against anyone who takes a view that is unpopular, and many more who are just opposed for being women or for being gay or for being conservative or whatever it happens to be? If the love of Jesus Christ is so beautiful, how is it that the church is consumed so often with hatred one for another? So much so that some years ago the Sunday Times headlined how these Christians hate one another. But we know that at the core of what and who we are is this message of reconciliation, this hope for the world, this beauty of love that overcomes not disagreement, but hatred, darkness, bitterness, the desire for the death and destruction of those who oppose us. There is nothing more wonderful than the love of Jesus Christ. God has made nothing more wonderful than the love of Jesus Christ. There is no plan B for God for this world. There's no alternative. This is it. And we are its witnesses, the people of God throughout the world. And secondly, we're sent. Evangelism is not an option for the church. Not all are evangelists, but all are witnesses. And here's the distinction. Every church has a priority of evangelism. Mission evangelism at the heart of all we do. It is a priority that goes with worship. Michael quite rightly received the award earlier. But he would say that a church, I hope he would say that a church that fails to be involved in witness is as bizarre as a church that fails to be involved in worship. One of our fellow diocesan bishops told me that about 2 years ago, a parish in his very large diocese, it wasn't London, wrote to him and said, "Dear Bishop, we are very excited about what you're saying about witness and evangelism in this diocese. However, we don't feel we're ready for witness and evangelism. So we are not going to do any for 2 years while we think about it." they got a letter back that said, "You may imagine what I would write to you if you said you would not hold a Eucharist for the next 2 years because you weren't ready for worship." I am going to say exactly the same thing to you now. I won't repeat the rest of the letter. It was brief and to the point, and basically had the sense of get on with it. Every church has a priority of evangelism. If we are not those who are declaring by word and deed the reality of the beauty of the love of Jesus Christ, we aren't doing what the church was created to do. It's just we're not doing it, and there's no plan B. If we're not doing it, nobody else, we the church, the people of God, if we're not doing it, nobody else is going to do it. I'm in a happy position that if I don't do my job, there's millions of people who do it instead of me, probably better. But nobody else will witness. Evangelism is the telling of the work of Jesus Christ for every person. People only know this if they're told. I spent 10 years going to compulsory chapel at school, morning and evening. That's why I still know matins and evensong by heart. I don't know how, because I never paid attention, but it sort of seeped in while I wasn't looking. During those 10 years, I can only remember one interesting moment. It was when the headmaster fell out of the pulpit. For some strange reason, the teachers at both schools I was at deleted from the lectionary all the interesting bits that might appeal to teenage boys. So all we got was the boring bits. Well, what we thought were boring. And we all did the same thing, which is we did the last bits of our homework for the day, or for the next day, behind our hymn books as the service went on. It's why I have no idea why I know the service by heart, but I do. It took the head teacher of the school at which I was pretending to teach, 70 miles north of Nairobi, between leaving school and going to university, it took that head teacher one quiet evening by a gas lamp to explain to me what it meant to be a Christian. And it took a friend, another student, 18 months later, to explain to me what the cross meant and the resurrection and that Christ was calling. People only know if they're told. Every church should engage in at least one activity that intends to share the message of the good news with the intention that people come to faith in Jesus Christ. It's part of what we do. It's not all by any means. It is part of what we do, and it needs to be deliberate. It requires praying, planning, and preparing. And for this, there are people who have particular gifts. But there is also the charge on those who are in positions of leadership in the church that we read in Timothy. Do the work of an evangelist. It is for all clergy and readers and lay leaders, all those recognized as leading in the church, to lead the people of God in evangelism. Some of the best decisions in my own time in ordained ministry have been for me to make space for personal evangelism. And as I said at the beginning, I find this hugely difficult. I went to a church before I was ordained, when we were back in London from living abroad for some years. I'm toying with the temptation to describe myself as a citizen of the world, but it might be unwise at the moment. Some of you have been reading your papers. At that church, there was an annual mission week in which you were meant to invite non-Christian friends to come to services, and there'd be talks, and you prayed for them and you invited them along. I was working in the oil business in an international oil company, and the week was flagged some months in advance. We all knew when it was going to be, and it was quite extraordinary how often I had an absolutely unchangeable foreign trip for the whole of that week. I found it terrifying to speak to people, to witness, partly because it was just duty, partly because everyone was looking to see who everyone else had brought along. It was all the wrong ways of doing evangelism. There are plenty of wrong ways. But once, after a long time, I began to realize that this wasn't about evangelism as a competitive sport. I invited 7 people this week. How many did you invite? It was about witnessing to what God had done in my life in answer to what people asked. It wasn't imposing on them what they didn't want to know. It was witness. And witness is a response to question. We give our witness when we're asked what happened. And I also discovered then, and since I was ordained, that the best decisions have been when I've made space for the opportunities to witness. There have been some extraordinary things over the last few years which have constantly reminded me of this. And it's never been easy. I still remember as a parish priest, when we were doing, and I'm not particularly saying this is the only course, we were doing an Alpha course. It was the first one we did in the parish. And there are plenty of other wonderful tools and resources for evangelism in a particular parish or church or gathering of Christians. After the first evening of the Alpha course, when everyone had gone and we put the chairs away, and because there wasn't a church hall, it had been in our front room, so we put all the chairs back in the front room and cleared up and washed up and all the things you do. And I said to my wife, that was really fun. And the cathedral cat has just walked across the aisle. Is this significant? Should I take a message from this? 5 minutes. That's really quite unsettling, Comes of having been at Glastonbury earlier today. I'm trying to work out what that really means. We try and make in my diary, just to give you an idea, some priority days during the year for my own work in mission and evangelism. It's quite difficult. Once you've taken out all the days that are there for family and time off, all the statutory things that we have to do and synods and all that, which are obviously very enjoyable indeed. Was I joking? I'll leave you to work that one out. And once you take out all that, I'm left with 81 working days in the year. And last year we had 4,200 invitations to use those 81 working days. So it's a bit difficult to make priority days, but we do. I have a wonderful diary secretary with a stare that could freeze boiling oil in seconds. And one of my colleagues will fix up what happens on one of those days, Chris Russell, the advisor on evangelism and witness. And I always grumble. And I remember last year we were going off somewhere to a town outside London to meet some people. It was meeting about 4 people. It was an hour's journey each way. I was very, very busy. And most of the way up there, I was saying, honestly, why are we doing this? Honestly, Can't you think of a better way of using my time than this? You know, real minge and whinge and grump mode. And we got there and we found this extraordinary group of young Christian women in this particular town who about 10 years earlier had felt a call to work with those caught up in the sex trade, most of them trafficked in that particular town. And if I say there were 3 of them doing it full time, and their budget for their whole charity for each month was just under £1,000 quid, you can see they weren't living comfortably. And it had taken 4 or 5 years before they started being asked into the brothels by the people running them, but they did, by the grace of God and after much prayer. And we went up and met them, and they brought a couple of people from the brothels with them, a couple of sex workers with them, who were terrified about coming to meet anyone because too many of their clients had been clergy. And we simply sat and I listened and I prayed with them. I didn't do anything. They asked me a little bit about this and that. We talked. I didn't preach a sermon. We just shared. And one of them, because of the work of these 3 young women and their extraordinary, shining, unconditional love, came to faith in Christ a few weeks later. And she came and about a year ago, almost 2 years ago now, at a Christmas carol service in Lambeth Palace in the Crypt Chapel, which is a sort of thin place. It's a wonderful place. She came and we had a carol service and we had 6 people, each of them gave a 90-second testimony to why this Christmas is going to be different. And she did that. There were some incredibly senior people there, you know, household names. Every single person, me included, were in floods of tears as this beautiful young woman talked about the difference that Jesus made to her. It wasn't everything was right. She was still in the sex trade. She was being trained and finding ways out. She's now out. But there you saw testimony from someone who didn't even know what testimony was. And it was beautiful beyond description. When we proclaim Jesus, we can't assume that people have ever heard of him. The news of the gospel is increasingly new news. It's not been heard before by so many, including that young woman. Grace, the gift of unconditional love, is so revolutionary. And we have to do it, and we have to proclaim it. Witness comes in, every Christian simply being able to witness what God has done for them in Christ. Not saying what anyone or everyone else has said, but simply saying what they know and what they don't know. And when they're asked the hard question, saying, I don't know. But I do know this about Christ, about Jesus. And when people see it lived and transformed lives, as we did in that young woman, many of them, not all, many of them are completely captivated by what they see. Let me give you 2 reactions to that carol service. One couple, as they went out, said, we thought we were coming to a proper carol service. It was full of proper carols, you know, little town of Bethlehem and, you know, come all ye faithful, all the stuff. We didn't mess about with the carols. And they said, we thought we were coming to a proper carol service, and instead the whole thing was about Jesus. Well, you can't win them all. And we won't win them all. But there was another person whose name I can't disclose because they asked it to be kept secret, but if I said it, you'd know instantly who they were. Really well-known, prominent person who a few months later was baptized and confirmed. And they were baptized and confirmed because they'd heard the testimony of Jesus Christ from a number of people, including a sex worker. So we must speak the good news in ways that are compatible with the good news. We must live as if Jesus truly is risen from the dead. There must never be manipulation or coercion. It involves listening and loving, knowing people, and having trusting relationships. And in this, the church has to be honest when it fails, which it constantly does. But the witness of honest confession of failure and seeking forgiveness is among the best witnesses to the compelling love of Jesus Christ. All this can lead us rather self-absorbed. However, this work of God is made possible with prayer. It begins in prayer. It's one of the reasons that for the last year and this next summer, between between Ascension and Pentecost, we are praying for the coming of the Spirit on every Christian that we might be witnesses. It's not doing the evangelism and witness, it's praying for God to give us, to open our hearts afresh to his love. Do make time during that period. It's one of the great traditional periods of the church's life to pray for the church's witness. Let us make space to invite the Spirit of God in this diocese, to wait on the Spirit of God, and to pray for the transforming presence of God, and in finding afresh in our own lives what it is to be captured by the love of Christ, to renew in ourselves our capacity to have something to which we witness, however feeble, however weak, however uncertain, that we are witnesses to the good news. Thank you.